Dr. Sarah Brennan's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the high-resolution scanner over the faded photograph. The basement archive of the Boston Heritage Museum was cold and smelled of old paper. She had been cataloging donated Victorian photographs for 3 weeks, and most were ordinary stiff portraits of forgotten families. This one looked the same at first. A studio portrait dated 1901 from Whitmore Photography Studio in Lawrence, Massachusetts. A well-dressed couple stood rigid, the man's hand on his wife's shoulder. Between them sat a small girl about 6 years old, in a white lace dress with ribbons in her dark hair. Her hands held a small bouquet of white lilies. Sarah watched the digital image appear on her screen and zoomed in. The father's face was stern, jaw clenched. The mother's eyes were red-rimmed, her mouth a thin, painful line. Then she looked at the child and her breath caught. The girl's eyes were open and staring at the camera, but empty. The pupils were too wide and the skin had a strange, waxy look. Sarah knew what she was seeing. "Oh God," she whispered, "she's dead." Post-mortem photography was common in Victorian times, a last way to keep an image of a child taken too soon. But something about this picture felt heavier. The careful posing, the parents' clear grief. Sarah pulled out the papers that came with the donated collection. She needed a name, a record, anything that would tell her who this little girl was. She had no idea this one photograph would take over the next 6 months of her life. All weekend, the image stayed with her. On Monday, she arrived early at the museum. The stamp on the back said Whitmore Photography Studio, 147 Essex Street, Lawrence, Massachusetts, 1901. She called the Lawrence Public Library and spoke to a librarian named Thomas. He confirmed James Whitmore had worked there from 1895 to 1908, but there were no client lists. He suggested the Lawrence History Center for death records. Sarah drove north a few days later. At the History Center, a young archivist named Elena brought out the 1901 death registers. Page after page showed children who had died. Near the end of March, she found clusters of the same cause, diphtheria. Then she saw the name. Rose Hartley, age 6, died March 31st, 1901. Parents William and Margaret Hartley. The initials M and H matched the small brooch on the mother's dress in the photograph. The address was 45 Jackson Street. The 1900 census showed William as a loom operator from England and Margaret born in Massachusetts to Irish parents. Jackson Street was a crowded immigrant neighborhood near the mills with poor sanitation. Elena pulled microfilm of the Lawrence Daily Eagle. Articles described a diphtheria outbreak that started in mid-March and killed more than 30 children in 3 weeks. One report said the water pump on Jackson Street was contaminated by seepage from an outhouse. The disease had been preventable. Sarah went to St. Anne's Church. Father Michael Riley showed her the burial records. Rose Catherine Hartley was buried April 3, 1901, along with 14 other children from the parish. Baptism records listed her godmother as Catherine Murphy, who had died of diphtheria only 3 days before Rose. Father Riley also found Father Patrick Donnelly's old journals. On March 31st, the priest wrote that he had baptized Rose himself years earlier. He described Margaret broken with grief, and William silent, but full of anger at the conditions that killed their daughter. William asked about a memorial photograph so Rose would be remembered looking peaceful in her best dress. Father Donnelly recommended James Whitmore. Back at the museum, Sarah traced the family forward. William and Margaret stayed in Lawrence and later had 2 more children, Thomas and Alice. Through an online forum, she found Jennifer Morrison in Maine, a descendant of Margaret. Jennifer had never known the name Rose. She brought a small silver brooch with the initials M and H, the same one visible in the photograph. She also had a faded diary written by Alice in 1920. In it, Margaret finally told her younger daughter about the sister who had died before she was born. Rose had been gentle, loved to sing, and helped care for younger children in the tenement. Jennifer gave permission for the museum to display the photograph. 6 months later, the Boston Heritage Museum opened an exhibition on Victorian memorial photography. The Hartley portrait was the centerpiece, shown with Rose's death certificate, Father Donnelly's journal notes, newspaper clippings, and a map of the old tenement district. A short panel told visitors that Rose was 6 when she died of diphtheria on March 31st, 1901, during an outbreak caused by contaminated water and overcrowded housing. She loved to sing and was learning to read. Her parents had the picture made so she would not be forgotten. On opening day, visitors stood quietly in front of the photograph. Jennifer came with her teenage daughter. An elderly man whose grandfather had worked in the Lawrence Mills told Sarah the story made the old statistics feel real. That evening, alone in the gallery, Sarah looked at the picture one more time. William and Margaret had scraped together the money in their worst grief so their daughter would be remembered. More than a century later, Rose's short life was no longer lost.